want to preface this by saying I'm not weighing in on this issue for the most part. But right now, we are being encouraged to get vaccinated against COVID 19. And we know people that are probably taking it and are eager to get it. And we know people that are absolutely refusing or are afraid. And sometimes we're afraid of something that's new or different. We're afraid of people sticking things into our body. Uh, I have a perspective on the whole issue of medicine and vaccines. It's not shared by all of my friends, and that's fine. But I grew up seeing people that suffered the effects of polio. And I remember a man that was in an iron lung when I was young. I remember a pastor that hobbled about due to the effects of that. I remember a lady that married one of our good friends that lived in braces because of polio. And then other people that I also knew that had had polio and knew them briefly, or family members that had suffered from polio in the past that I didn't ever get to meet. And so we don't think about that. When was the last time you worried about polio yourself or contracting polio? And we don't. And I use all of that as a preface for the fact that Paul, I think, is going to talk about something you and I don't particularly worry about today. I don't as a man, but I could worry about it with regard to my wife, and women could worry about it, and you'll see what it is in a moment. We're talking in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 about regeneration. Being joined to Christ and having the Spirit in us, we have a kind of mind, the kind of mind that Christ has, as he says at the end of verse 16. And because the Spirit is the one that leads us, we're able to appraise. If you're spiritual, following his lead, you're able to appraise or evaluate all things. And those all things go back up to verse 9 here in 1 Corinthians 2, being things that God's prepared for those who are loving him. And I'm Pastor Tim Holscher. We're looking at these benefits, considering some of these things that God's promised, because we read that, things God's promised for those who are loving him, but sometimes we've never taken the time to actually look at the fact that God reveals some of these things that he's prepared for us. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, at the end of the chapter, this chapter is addressing believers in the church living as they should. And it seems to be a little bit of some hostility issues. He has to address some hostility problems with the men at the first part and has to deal with some hostility issues with the women here at the last part of the chapter. And they both are very similar. The problems are very similar. When we come down to verse 15, and we have a verse that, there's disagreement on this. And I've got good friends that don't agree with what I say, and I don't agree with the way they understand this. First, verse 15, just reading through it, says, "But women will be preserved through the bearing of children if they continue in faith and love and sanctity with self-restraint." And the word women comes from the previous section where that's who he is addressing. He says, but they will be saved. It's a passive verb. They're not saving themselves. Somebody else is going to save them through childbirth. Now, childbirth or bearing of children through this dia over here can be understood in a variety of ways. And in this context, I would say the two that best fit this would either be they're going to be saved by actually going through this process. God's going to be not saving them physically in childbirth, but by going through childbirth, there's a benefit of salvation that they reap. That's one option. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. There's also the view that they are saved while going through childbirth. That is, that they don't die. Now, that view, just to be clear, and these are the two views that I think merit some consideration. There are other views, but I think these two of the ones I've looked at to kind of pare this down, I think these are the two that we ought to think about. The first one is why I use the illustration of people being afraid of vaccines, because they don't know what it is, and people being afraid of used to be fearful of polio and we're not anymore. And when was the last time you met a woman that really genuinely was fearful of dying in childbirth? I mean, it's so rare in our modern culture for women to suffer death in the process of giving birth, but you go even 100 years ago, and the death rate of women giving birth was much higher than this, and it was considered even higher at the time that Paul was writing 2,000 years ago. And therefore, that God would promise those women that, if you are continuing remaining at ease in faith, which goes back to an issue in chapter 1 that Paul's talked about how we live, and love, which the object of living by faith back in chapter 1 is to have an unhypocritical love, a genuine love. And then sanctification, that you really are living set apart to God, and you're doing so with an attitude that thinks about what is proper, what fits our salvation, whether that's our physical salvation or spiritual salvation. And he says, if you're continuing at ease in there, he says, you women don't need to go into death being fearful. You don't need to be fearful of going through that process. God will save you. Now, I know if you teach that, there are people that are going to object and say, wait a second, I knew somebody that they suffered and they died in childbirth and they were a very loving person. And of course, I don't know that person, and so I can't speak to that, other than to say that sometimes we say from a certain perspective that a person is very loving and really demonstrates faith. But whether it's genuine love from God's perspective, and whether they really are living by faith, that's something I would say to some degree that God is the one that decides. Anyway, leave that one. That's the view that I favor. You may disagree with me on that. I have a good friend that he teaches that the bearing of children actually is referring to more than actually the physical process of bringing a child into the world, but the whole process of rearing a child and raising them up to adulthood. And that's part of their, using the word save, part of their being saved in their present tense. And I could see the view. I've sat and listened to the class, and there's things about it that I think merit consideration. I don't see that as what Paul is saying here, but I'm just putting that out, that it's, to me, it bears enough consideration that I want to share that part of maybe what God has determined for you as an individual is to be exercising faith and love, but you can do so even while raising your children. And that can be part of how you're growing in your spiritual life, in your present tense salvation. So whether we're talking about physically being saved through this or growing spiritually in the raising of children, one way or another, we have a promise from God of salvation. And it's a promise that comes for those who are loving. And this love, obviously, what he says over there in 1 Corinthians 2:9 is that they're loving God. But remember, if you're loving, and I believe Paul would be saying here that they're loving other believers, would be the idea in the context, you love God by loving other believers. So a person that's continuing at ease in this love would be loving God. And they could cash in on, or maybe that's not the best term, but they can relate to a promise God has made to them. And again, in our culture where we don't fear death, maybe we fear death in childbirth so much, this might be something we maybe don't appreciate as much as first century believers did. But one way or another, whether it's growth or whether it's physically being delivered in the process, it is a promise. It's a promise for you to think about, to consider, and to relate to, perhaps. Maybe share with somebody else, because you might know somebody else that maybe they would benefit from understanding the real value on a very practical level of living by faith and love, and how it affects our life, whether it's our spiritual life and growth or whether it's talking about our physical life continuing. And as we think about that and relate to that and share that with others, we can be encouraging them to have a good day in the Lord. Thank you for joining me today.